Hello, you guys. Welcome back for episode 4 of the Crime with Kylie podcast. I am so glad that you are here for today's episode. Now, before we get into today's episode, I do feel the need to put in a trigger warning because we will be discussing child abuse, child sexual assault, and ultimately child death. I feel like this is one of those cases that will deeply frustrate and disturb you. Honestly, after researching it, writing everything out, and now speaking about it, I truly feel sick to my stomach. This is one of those times, once again, where so many people knew, so many people had the opportunity to stop it, to do something, to go tell the authorities, and they didn't. And because no one did, a beautiful young lady with so much potential and a future in front of her had her life ended and stolen from her. So with this case and with this episode, we're really going to try to keep who Sylvia was and her story very much alive, so that way she is not forgotten. So today's episode is going to be on the case of 16-year-old Sylvia Likens. Let's get into it. Sylvia Likens was born January 3rd of 1949 in southern Boone County near Indianapolis. Sylvia's family consisted of her mom and dad, who were Betty and Lester, and then Sylvia had 4 siblings. There were 5 total. The oldest was Diana, and then there was Danny, and then there was Sylvia. She was the middle child, and then the younger ones were the twins, who were Benny and Jenny. And the majority of this case is going to revolve around Sylvia and Jenny. So what was Sylvia like? Sylvia was bright and cheery, and she was very giving. For extra spending money, Sylvia would babysit, she would run errands, she would do chores like ironing, and even though that was technically her money that she earned, she would always give her mother Betty a portion of it. And also at the time, Sylvia loved the Beatles. She loved to listen to their music every chance that she got. During one of their childhood games, while Sylvia was roughhousing with her brother, she lost one of her front teeth, and she was very embarrassed of that, so whenever she smiled for photos, she would keep her mouth closed. But for the most part, that was the extent of Sylvia's shyness. She was very outgoing. Unlike her younger sister Jenny, she would always hold her sister's hands while she ice skated, and she was known as Cookie by her friends. Now let's talk about Sylvia's family. Sylvia's father, Lester, was born in Lebanon and only had an 8th grade education. He took up many odd jobs during his teenage and his adult years. He ran a laundry route at one point, he sold concessions at carnivals, which is what he was doing in the summer of 1965, which we'll get to shortly, and he did many other things like work in factories. And he even ran his own small restaurant at one point in time, although ultimately it was unsuccessful. Although times were hard on him, Lester was nonetheless a good dad and a very hard worker. No matter what, he always tried to make a better life for his 5 children. Sylvia's mother Betty was born on March 2nd of 1927, and she was born in Indianapolis. Betty has been described by her children as a good mother. Although Betty and Lester had a very rocky marriage, they could both agree on one thing, which was their children. They both loved their children dearly. The couple split up and got back together many times, but ultimately, after what happened to Sylvia, they divorced in 1966. After that, Lester moved to Las Vegas and he worked in the gaming industry for a little bit, and then he moved in with his oldest child, Diana. Betty remarried twice after divorcing Lester and ultimately led a very reclusive life. She never quite got over what happened to Sylvia, which, as we'll get into, is extremely understandable, and she ultimately died at age 71. And she was buried next to her 3rd husband. Okay, now that you guys have some background information, let's jump to the summer of 1965. Now, during the summer, Lester and Betty really needed to make some money to support their family, so they were going to go and join a traveling carnival and sell concessions. But a traveling carnival was no place for 5 children. Well, 4, because Diana was already off and married at that point. So they needed to go and make some arrangements, and this ended up with Danny and Benny going and staying with their grandparents. Now, I don't know if it was a money issue or a space issue, but for whatever reason, Sylvia and Jenny couldn't also go and stay with their grandparents, so Lester and Betty needed to find a solution, somewhere for them to go, and they needed to find it quick. And this brings us to Gertrude Vanchewski. Betty met Gertrude at Sylvia's school. Gertrude's daughter Paula was in the same grade as Sylvia. Paula was 17 and Sylvia was 16. Now I'm assuming that Betty was talking to Gertrude about how she didn't know where she was going to put her girls for the summer. And Gertrude already had 7 children at home, so what was 2 more? Gertrude offered to take Sylvia and Jenny for the summer for $20 a week, which today would have been around $170 a week. And for Sylvia's family, that was a lot of money, but Betty agreed because she really didn't see that she had another option. And after that, it was decided that Sylvia and Jenny were going to stay with Gertrude and her 7 children for the summer. But on July 3rd of 1965, Betty Likens got arrested for shoplifting, and so Lester was left to make the arrangements with Gertrude. And Lester was in a rush. He really didn't know much about Gertrude. He didn't even go over to her house to check if things were okay there. If they did, they would have immediately realized that there were no living conditions for Gertrude's 7 children, let alone their children. There was barely enough food in the house for one person, and there weren't even enough beds or bedrooms, and the entire house was filthy. After Sylvia and Jenny were dropped off at the house, the first 2 weeks went great. As a child, Jenny had polio, and as a result, her leg was a bit crippled and she struggled to walk. She also wore a leg brace. So because she knew that her sister couldn't help, Sylvia offered to help around Gertrude's house. Additionally, Jenny and Sylvia had no problem attending Sunday school and church with Gertrude and her 7 children. And her 7 children, I believe Paula was the oldest and the youngest was 1 year old. The rest were like 13, 15, 8, and 9. However, issues in their stay started to arise when the Likens didn't send the $20 to Gertrude. It was late. But instead of trying to contact Sylvia and Jenny's parents like a completely sane person, Gertrude instead decided to take a belt and a paddle to Sylvia and Jenny. This was a very physically weak woman. She was underweight and she also had asthma, but nonetheless she would use weapons like the paddle and the belt against the girls as punishment. She was very into the, corporal punishment. On one day in August of 1965, Sylvia and Jenny were beaten 15 times each with the paddle. And the only reason that Sylvia and Jenny were beaten that day was because Paula, who was 17 years old, went and told her mother Gertrude that the girls had overeaten that day. Also, it's probably important to note now that for whatever reason, Paula really did not like Sylvia. And over the years, the reason for that has been assumed to be jealousy. Now, a huge possible reason as to why Paula was jealous of Sylvia is because Paula was 3 months pregnant at the time that this was all happening. And remember that Paula came from a very religious and very strict family. So for her to have gotten pregnant out of wedlock at such a young age, that was a bit taboo. And it seemed like she really just didn't like Sylvia just for Sylvia existing. Sylvia didn't actually do anything to Paula. She was nothing but kind to Paula, but later on Gertrude decided to make this excuse that everything that happened was because Sylvia spread a rumor that Paula was a prostitute. And I think Gertrude tried to say that Sylvia said this about another one of her daughters as well. But nonetheless, torture and abuse is absolutely inexcusable. It doesn't matter if there was a rumor or not. That's just ridiculous. And the abuse and the torture of the girls went on for months because, mind you, they weren't supposed to be picked up until November. And November is when their parents would return, pick up their brothers, and then pick up them. And then they were supposed to, I think, move to the East Coast where the carnival was. However, that never ended up happening. And it seems like as the weeks went on, the torture just got worse for Sylvia. And I think Sylvia tried to act as a shield for her 15-year-old sister, Jenny. Because Jenny had a limp, because she had the leg brace, Sylvia could not stand to see her sister take the brunt of the abuse, so Sylvia took it for her. By August, they were being given over a dozen beatings a week. And soon enough, it wasn't just Paula and Gertrude, but it was also Paula's little sister, who I believe was also 15, and then a 10-year-old little brother, and then the rest of the neighborhood kids. Yeah, that's right, the neighborhood kids. These random neighborhood children would come inside of Gertrude's home and beat Sylvia, kick her, punch her, for fun. And Gertrude deemed this as okay. She found it okay that her children were abusing another child and that she was allowing other people's children to abuse this child. After the fact, so many neighbors came forward and said that they heard Sylvia screaming in agony and pain regularly. But because it was none of their business, they didn't do a thing to help her. They figured that a caregiver or a parent could punish their child as they see fit, even if it's torture. And apparently one of the days that Gertrude took Sylvia to church with the rest of the children and Jenny, they were having free hot dogs, giving them away, and Gertrude had Sylvia eat as many as she possibly could, just gorge herself, and then she threw up because obviously she did not want to eat that much, and then because Sylvia was wasting good food, Gertrude allegedly made Sylvia eat her own vomit. And for a few months during all of this, Sylvia was still going to Sunday school every day with the rest of the children. So the teachers would see the welts on her, the burn marks from the cigarettes, and they didn't find it to be their place to say anything either. And Gertrude would regularly have these other neighborhood children over to her home just to beat Sylvia after school, and they would do it as casual entertainment. Like, they would go and hurt Sylvia and then eat dinner, or abuse her and then go watch TV together. It's absolutely sickening what they were doing to this poor girl, and she couldn't reach out to anyone. She was afraid that if she told a teacher or told another adult that they wouldn't believe her and that the abuse would just get worse. And it was in late August, early September, that all of the children returned to regular school, including Sylvia. Sylvia went to Arsenal Tech High School and she began working in the cafeteria in early September. Also, apparently on September 1st of 1965, while at school, Anna Cisco got into a fight with Sylvia, where she began to kick Sylvia and abuse her. And Sylvia apparently cried out, "Oh, my baby." And also in early September, Paula decided to choke Sylvia out, and initially Gertrude broke this up, but afterwards said let them fight and let the girls have it out. And then on October 5th of 1965, Sylvia's parents actually came to visit. The Likens came to visit their daughters, and during the visit, Lester gave Sylvia money for a new pair of shoes, and then he told Gertrude that they would be back in 3 weeks. Now, I don't know why the girls didn't tell their parents about the abuse then. I don't know if Gertrude had them on their best behavior, because the girls knew that they were going to be left with Gertrude for another 3 weeks, that they didn't want to make things worse for themselves. I have not been able to find an answer to that yet. But the very next day, October 6th of 1965, was Sylvia Likens' last day at school at Arsenal Technical High School. Gertrude told the school that she was pulling Sylvia out because Sylvia had no interest in education and no interest in school, which was a complete lie. Gertrude pretended to be concerned. She said that this was for Sylvia's best interest, but in reality it's because Gertrude wanted to lock Sylvia in the basement, and that is what she did. Now sadly, it was down in the basement where the true horrors began. And I don't know exactly what date this happened, but at some point between August and September of 1965, Gertrude had Sylvia completely undressed in the living room with the rest of her 7 children watching, and Sylvia was forced to insert a Coke bottle inside of herself. And what I found with this case especially is that there are so many different accounts of what happened. And this is most likely due to the fact that there have been books written based off of her case or movies made based off of her case, so it's very easy for fact and fiction to mix up here, especially considering that this happened in 1965, so it's kind of like an ongoing game of telephone as I've been researching this. As always, if you're listening on YouTube, the sources will be linked below, but I have read about the Coke bottle incident many times in multiple different articles. Other sources have said that Sylvia was completely violated and that she was raped. However, her autopsy report did not show that. However, what her autopsy did eventually show was that her vaginal cavity was very swollen. And this could have been for many reasons. A big one is that Paula would frequently kick Sylvia there. She would mutilate her there. And Paula even tried to start this rumor that Sylvia was with child, which she wasn't. And she would just kick her there, beat her stomach, her uterus area, etc. And now while this was all going on, while Paula was kicking Sylvia in her groin and her uterus area, Gertrude was giving sexual purity speeches to Sylvia. She was lecturing Sylvia on sexual immorality, all while her pregnant, unmarried daughter was beating Sylvia. Honestly, I think that Gertrude and Paula both are just wicked and insane. And eventually, this abuse and torture, especially in that area, led to Sylvia not being able to control her bladder. She couldn't go and willingly pee or anything like that. So because of that damage, she would pee herself. Because she started doing that due to the abuse that Gertrude and Paula and all these other neighborhood kids were putting her through, Gertrude decided that Sylvia was uncleanly and unfit to live in her home amongst the rest of her children. Around the same time period, Gertrude would accuse Sylvia of stealing from her and burn her fingertips as a result. And it was also in the basement where Sylvia was rarely fed. She was occasionally given crackers, but mostly had to sort through the garbage for something to eat. She was extremely malnourished and weak. And then it was on October 23rd of 1965 that Sylvia was branded. I know we've mentioned the prostitute topic before, but that was a very ongoing topic in the household where Paula was accused of being a prostitute apparently, and then they would accuse Sylvia of being a prostitute, and Gertrude was very high and mighty of, my children are religious children, they are children of God, they would not do such things, but she loved to believe that Sylvia was this horrible, impure person. So while Sylvia was lying down on the mattress in the basement, Gertrude took a needle and began to etch, I am a prostitute and proud of it, into Sylvia's belly. And then Richard Hobbs, who was 15 years old, one of the neighborhood kids, came and finished the etching. They also etched the number 3 into her upper chest. 2 days later, on October 25th of 1965, a boy named Coy hit Sylvia over the head with a broomstick and she went unconscious. And it was also around that same time that Sylvia tried to escape for the last time. She tried to escape out of the basement, but one of Gertrude's boys caught her and he beat her. And at that point, Sylvia was so weak, she was so malnourished, she had been beaten so many times that she couldn't get back up and her body could no longer handle it. It was at that point that Gertrude finally thought that Sylvia might be dying, and instead of getting Sylvia the proper help that she needed, instead of phoning the police, instead of just taking her to the hospital, Gertrude instead made Sylvia, in her last moments, write this note saying that a gang of boys came and beat her. Before Sylvia passed away, Gertrude also made Sylvia write another letter, but this letter was to her parents. This letter that Gertrude completely dictated said the following: To Mr. and Mrs. Likens. Instead of saying to Mom and Dad, it reads, I went with a gang of boys in the middle of the night, and they said that they would pay me if I would give them something, so I got in the car and they all got what they wanted. And when they got finished, they beat me up and left sores on my face and all over my body. And they also put on my stomach, I am a prostitute and proud of it. I've done just about everything that I could do to make Gertie mad and cause Gertie more money than she's got. I've tore up a new mattress and peed on it. I have also cost Gertie doctor bills that she really can't pay and made Gertie a nervous wreck and all of her kids. And I usually don't use profanity in these videos, but fuck Gertrude. I cannot imagine making Sylvia in her last moments write that humiliating and horrible letter. She did not go with any boys. She did not let them do things to her. She didn't pee the bed on purpose. She wasn't given a new mattress. She wasn't causing trouble. I can't imagine how Gertrude didn't get more time in prison, especially after reading that. Sadly, it wasn't long after writing that note that Sylvia passed away and succumbed to her injuries. Sylvia died in agony and pain and fear. And she did not deserve that whatsoever. Sylvia was a 16-year-old girl with a family who loved her so much. She had a future in front of her. She had things that she loved in life. And Gertrude and Paula and Gertrude's other children and these random neighborhood children took that all away from her. And for what? Entertainment? Jealousy? Gertrude's plan was to take Sylvia's body and dump her body into the woods with a note attached, saying that a gang of boys came and beat her up. For whatever reason, she didn't end up doing that, and instead they moved Sylvia's body upstairs onto a mattress and then phoned the police, and Gertrude told the police that a gang of boys came and beat Sylvia. However, just upon looking at her body, they knew that the injuries that she had were not from a one-time incident. It was also on October 26th of 1965 that Lester and Betty received a call saying that Sylvia had died. At the time, they were in Florida. By October 27th of 1965, Lester and Betty were back and they claimed Sylvia's body and began to plan a funeral. Gertrude, Paula, and Richard were quickly arrested and charged. However, justice was never quite carried out. The trial began in early May of 1966. Lester testified against Gertrude, Jenny testified against Gertrude, and Stephanie and Shirley, two of Gertrude's daughters, even agreed to testify against their mother and their sibling. On May 11th of 1966, Gertrude continued to insist that she was innocent, and she decided to blame her children for this. By May 19th of 1966, Gertrude and Paula and Richard were all found guilty of murder. Gertrude and Paula initially received life in prison for first-degree murder. Richard Hobbs, Johnny, one of Gertrude's other sons, and another neighborhood boy named Coy were all found guilty as well. However, they were only sentenced to 2 to 21 years for manslaughter. But just 2 years later, all 3 of those boys were granted parole for good behavior. And we are talking about the same boys that would beat her, that would verbally abuse her, and Richard, who carved that into her stomach. Despite the fact that Paula was initially sentenced to life in prison, she only ended up serving 2 years. Afterwards, she changed her name, she moved to a small town in Iowa, and she got married. She got a happily ever after that Sylvia should have gotten. Paula also gave birth to her baby at some point during the trial, and it was a girl, and Paula ended up naming the baby Gertrude. However, sources have said that the baby was removed from Paula and was given to a nice couple, and that baby has now grown up and since become a doctor. Paula changed her name to Paula Pace and tried to work at a school as a teacher's aide in Conrad, Iowa. However, after a few months, they finally realized who she truly was. I don't know how she was able to fake the documents, but they ended up firing her. And then a few years later, in 1985, Gertrude was also granted parole, and Gertrude changed her name to Nadine Van Fosen, and she went and lived in Iowa as well. However, in 1990, 5 years later, she passed away from lung cancer. And on that day, Jenny wrote a note to her mom. She wrote her mom a letter and celebrating that Gertrude had finally died. Sylvia Marie Likens was given a beautiful funeral service, and she was buried in Oak Hill Cemetery. She was also given a beautiful memorial statue, which I'm sure you guys are seeing now if you're watching this via video. But due to all of the injuries on her body, she was given a closed casket funeral. Jenny was extremely brave in testifying against Gertrude. I can't imagine what Jenny was going through, having to retell every single thing that was happening to her sister. Jenny was incredibly brave, and she recalled in her final moments, Sylvia's final moments, that Sylvia told her, I know you don't want me to die, but I'm going to die. Sylvia was very aware of her fate, and Jenny had to retell all of it to the courtroom. Jenny was ultimately comforted by her oldest sister, Diana, who came back for the trial. And Jenny ended up moving in with Diana and moved to California because she needed a change of scenery and she could not stand being in that place any longer, which is completely understandable. Jenny ended up getting married. She grew up. She lived a relatively reclusive life, though, because she was understandably traumatized by what happened to her. And she passed away in 2004 following a heart attack. I think it's important in this case especially to not just remember Sylvia as a victim, but also remember her as a hero. She protected her little sister Jenny the best that she could, and every decision that she made she thought was the right one. She weighed it out. She really did not think it was safe to tell anyone. And with all the times that she almost did or that she was caught trying to escape, it's very understandable why she thought that way. Let's remember Sylvia as someone who was bright, who was cheery, who was a light to the world, someone who should always be remembered. So thank you guys for listening to Sylvia's case. Please keep her in your thoughts, and I will see you guys next week.